Looks like we're live on Facebook. My name is Sarah Vitale, and I'm the co-founder of the Radical Philosophy Hour with Brandon Absher, the co-chair of the Radical Philosophy Association. We're very excited to be joining you today for our third event in our new monthly series. I encourage you to check out our previous events on our Facebook page and mark your calendar for next month's Radical Philosophy Hour, which is going to be held on the second Monday rather than the first because of the holiday. So Monday, July 12th, we'll be joined by Benjamin Curtis and Reese Faust. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jason Reed and Dr. Ashley Bohrer. I'm going to introduce them to you right now, and then they'll each present their papers, and then we will have time for a question and answer at the end. So Dr. Jason Reed is a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine, the author of Micropolitics of Capital, Marx and the Prehistory of the Present with SUNY, and The Politics of Transindividuality with Brill and Haymarket, and a forthcoming collection of essays, The Production of Subjectivity Between Marxism and Post-Structuralism, which will be published by Brill and Haymarket. He blogs on popular culture, philosophy, and politics at unemployednegativity.com. He is currently writing a book titled The Double Shift, Marx and Spinoza on the Politics and Ideology of Work. And he will be presenting a paper titled Preemptive Strikes of a Philosophical Variety, Marx and Spinoza. Ashley J. Bohrer is a scholar activist based in Chicago. She is assistant professor of gender and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame. She holds a PhD in philosophy from DePaul University. Along with Justin DeLeon, she co-hosts Pedagogies for Peace podcast. She currently serves as the public philosophy editor for the blog of the American Philosophical Association. In addition to her academic work, Ashley devotes much of her time to social movements for intersectional and anti-capitalist liberation. At the moment, she spends most of her movement time with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, Jewish Voice for Peace, and the Chicago chapter of Never Again Action. You can read more about her work at ashleybohrer.com. Her paper is titled, How Is It to Be Done? Dilemmas of Prefigurative and Harm Reduction Approaches to Social Movement Work. So as I said, Jason and Ashley will both present their papers and we'll have time for Q&A. Please drop any questions you have in the comment section as you come up with the questions, any questions or comments, and we will direct them to Jason and Ashley afterwards. All right, Jason, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. So I hope, when I think I got the email about doing this, I just kind of blurted out the first thing that came to mind. I hope it's not too academic and too inside baseball, but I'm going to sort of talk about what I was writing about more than read. And I've been, like a lot of people in sort of Marxist circles, I've been drawn to the Marx-Spinoza relation. This comes up in the work of Antonio Negri, Louis Althusser, Etienne Balibar, Hassana Sharp, etc. And in some sense, it's a very strange relation because I feel like in philosophy, there are two dominant models, which I think the relation between two different philosophers. One is a kind of sort of relation of descent and anxiety of influence. How did X influence Y? And the other relation is a relation of sort of opposition or argument. What would X say to Y? And to some extent, Marx and Spinoza fit in neither of those templates. I mean, Marx was influenced by Spinoza, and he copied notes of Spinoza's Tractatus Theologica Politicus into his notebooks, but no more so than anyone else in Germany in the 19th century. It's not a particularly important point of reference, though people argue about that. And on the other hand, Marx and Spinoza are too different to really think about a kind of argument between the two of them. So that poses, in some sense, the question that I want to think about, which is the question of the practice of philosophy. I mean, there's this line by Althusser, which is very famous, in which he says, Marx did not initiate a new philosophy of praxis with a K, kind of referring to the way that people like Sartre and before him, Lukács, tried to sum up all of philosophy and through this notion of praxis, but that Marx initiated a new practice of philosophy, a new way of doing philosophy. Now here too, right, Marx and Spinoza couldn't seem more different. Spinoza, especially his most famous and in some sense most central work, the Ethics, is written with the famous more geometrico, famous geometrical method, with a very dry outline of propositions and so on and so forth. Marx's writing, much of it comes to us in a series of drafts and notes, but even Capital, to take the major work finished during his lifetime, which is in some sense very well finished and very well organized, is in some sense the exact opposite of that kind of rigorous movement through propositions, in that it combines elements of economics, philosophy, history, politics, crossing different disciplinary boundaries before they were even erected to some extent. But the one point of contact that I want to talk about between these two writers and two texts is and they're both very well known passages, the appendix to part 1 of Spinoza's Ethics, in which Spinoza kind of outlines in a very different way, after arguing why God should not be considered to be sort of an anthropocentric figure acting with an end in view, why it is, Spinoza gives a kind of genealogy of how it is we arrive at the two sort of major illusions of not just philosophers that have come before, but most in the broader culture in general. And those two illusions are the illusion of the free subject and the illusion of God acting as a human being. And as Spinoza argues, we get these two illusions because we are born conscious of our desires and ignorant of the causes of things, and thus we use our consciousness of our desires to make sense of ourselves. We assume that our desires, since we're very aware of them, they seem very present to us, that we are the cause of them, not examining the way in which our desires are themselves the product of social relations, to put it in a sort of Marxist vocabulary. So that's the first text is Spinoza's appendix to part 1, and then the other text is equally famous, the end section of chapter 1 of Capital, and this famous section on commodity fetishism, which also in a similar way deals with how a particular way of comporting oneself creates a particular illusion, although here it's less a kind of anthropological illusion, a more a socio-historical one, the way in which our life in a commodity producing society, in which production is done in relative isolation or separation, we come to see value as not being a product of labor, but a value as intrinsic properties of commodities as we are presented to them. So I want to talk briefly about a couple ways in which these two sort of texts are similar. First, this is where I get the title of, these assertions by both Spinoza and Marx are very preemptive, in the sense that, especially you see this in Spinoza, I mean, he hasn't even gotten to, later he'll talk about the mind, the affects, desire, but before he can even get there, he has to kind of do this preemptive strike. And I think both Marx and Spinoza's preemptive strike is very similar. They're very similar kind of, they understand that they are going against the prevailing common sense of their time. And they recognize that before they can even really get started, they have to sort of stop and say, okay, wait a minute. Like you're not going to, in some sense, agree with everything I've said and I'm going to say, because you're caught up in this kind of illusion or ideology that you're not even aware of. So they're both to some extent preemptive in their strikes. Before, because in a similar way, Marx, starts talking about like different conditions of production, because the only way you can get outside of commodity fetishism is to be outside of capitalism. So he gives these examples: Robinson Crusoe alone on his island, producing his own necessities, the medieval world, and the kind of proto-communist assertion of a free society of producers. And likewise, those examples are kind of preemptive in the sense that Marx hasn't even, and to some extent in Capital, never even gets to the point where he fully fleshes out what he means by a mode of production, and how production and how people perceive and understand the world are thoroughly intertwined, which I think is Marx's assertion, but he never really develops that even in Capital. So these strikes become, these assertions come prior to the philosophical ground that would make them possible. And I think the very interesting thing that connects Spinoza and Marx around this idea of thinking about what a practice of philosophy is that they are in some sense two thinkers who recognize the limitations of what I consider to be the often assumed spontaneous philosophy of the practice of philosophy, whereas philosophers by general assume that everyone who is reading and paying attention to them can be persuaded in the exact same way, and that all one has to do is lay out one's ideas in the most persuasive way and one will be convincing. And I think both Marx and Spinoza, as in some sense materialists, recognize that how we live shapes how we think, and thus we are not always going to be persuaded by even the most persuasive or best argument, because of the fact that prior to our capacity to be persuaded is our investment in a particular way of living, and that particular way of living in some sense preempts our way of thinking. So philosophy has to figure out a way to engage and intersect with the sort of beliefs integral to the way people live before it can even be understood or taken seriously. That's what I mean by a preemptive strike. So, and that's about 10 minutes, so I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Jason. Ashley.
Oh, I'm going to be longer than Jason, who was so succinct. Okay. We'll have tons of time for questions. I just want to start by saying that I'm calling in from my apartment on the south side of Chicago, which is on the unceded territory that is the traditional homeland of several Indigenous people, including the Council of the Three Fires. I think often in philosophy, we bypass the question of settler colonization as the condition for the possibility of so much of our academic work, especially those of us who live and work in the United States, Canada, and other settler colonial nations. And, but as we know, like thought is totally dependent on its conditions of elaboration. And so, especially in the context of talking about social movements, which I'm about to do, and theories for understanding justice and liberation, it's important, I think, to begin with the fact that the conditions in which this theory about justice are elaborated is themselves contingent on some really heinous and ongoing injustice. With that. So I think, for scholars who talk about social movements, I think we are often drawn to comment on the question of like, what is to be done? What's the problem? What's the solution? But as both a scholar and an activist myself, I think some of the most fertile grounds for especially movement-generated theory, movement-generated philosophy, organic intellectualism, whatever you want to call it, actually stem not from the what is to be done question, but the how is it to be done question. And so today I want to focus on one of the most common axes of the how debate in contemporary social movement spaces in the US. And I like to think about this as the divergence between prefigurative approaches to politics on the one hand and harm reduction approaches on the other. This sort of like debate has been really constant in my own intellectual history and in my own experience of activist work across various different issues and organizations. And so I think it's actually a really helpful way to talk about some cross-movement issues as well. And to sort of clarify each of these positions, I find it helpful to think about them through the two often counterposed maxims of organizing work that embody these approaches. And so one of these maxims comes from Audre Lorde: the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Evoking the imagery of the plantation, right, Lorde is sort of powerfully staging the impossibility of relying on instruments of oppression in order to undo that oppression. She calls in particular attention to the tendency of movements to, despite their best intentions, replicate the very domination and oppression that they seek to contest. And so in part, this unwitting replication is caused, sort of Lorde tells us, by a reliance on the institutions, the strategies, the discourses of dominant or hegemonic power. And for Lord, this is always going to be a problem. It is only ever going to reconfirm it. And so liberation politics have to be prefigurative, meaning we have to always act as if liberation has come. We have to embody the world to come in the present. Or else we sort of risk becoming the thing we hate, or defanging the possibility of liberation movements. And this has been really powerfully taken up in social movements by the writer and facilitator Adrienne Maree Brown, who deepens this line of thinking into a full-scale model of social justice organizing. And she argues that how activists do their work is just as important as what their goals are. In what she calls Emergent strategy, in a book by the same name, Brown argues that the way we approach our work, even in small-scale collectives, will impact how we envision and implement large-scale change. It would be interesting for professors to think about that in terms of the how of education, but I'm not going to go there. Brown sort of thus expands Lord's insight about the dangers of replicating the expectations of power, extending the kind of scope of what we might think about as the master's tools, all the way down to individual and interpersonal relations in activist spaces, and in the like hundreds and thousands of micro decisions that activists and movements make. So this perspective is really rooted in the question, what really will we have done in the end if we have reconfirmed and perhaps even strengthened the illusion that the master's tools are all there is? But a sort of competing maxim of social justice strategy, this is going to be the harm reduction approach, I think is powerfully voiced by someone like Malcolm X, by any means necessary. On a certain reading of this perspective, all tactics, all institutions, all discourses become at least potentially available to social movements, even potentially what Lord would call the master's tools. Here, the urgency of countering domination takes center stage. In situations of intense structural violence, expediency itself can be a central value and also an important strategic and tactical consideration. Rather than a prefigurative approach to political work, this line of thinking, I think, foregrounds the necessity of using every tool available to us because the dangers of not doing so are too great. A modified version of this position asks whether oppression and domination have so saturated not only the field of power, but even our own minds and subjectivities that we may not have access to tools that are free from any relation to the master, right? So as decolonial theorist Serene Khader argues, resistance by definition occurs under non-ideal conditions. And so for that reason, and she's talking here about feminist movements, quote, practices that effectively increase gender justice in an unjust society may diverge from those that would exist in a society that was already just, end quote. So for Khader, evaluating strategies of resistance through their fidelity to prefigurative politics might actually skew our understanding about how resistance operates. She continues, quote, to claim that an exercise of power is resistant is to make a claim about its capacity to bring about diachronic change, not about whether we would expect to see it under conditions of gender justice, end quote. So Khader here highlights what in activist spaces is often called a harm reduction philosophy. Resistance strategies should be evaluated in terms of whether they overall reduce harm in society, even if for one, they make use of problematic existing structures, discourses, tactics, or tools. The sort of Malcolm X Khader approach warns that while some amount, I think, of introspection is necessary for social justice work, the Lord Brown approach, or this prefigurative approach, can sometimes direct all organizing strategies potentially inward in a constant sort of self-excoriation that can detract from mobilizing and organizing against overarching structures of power. This perspective is rooted in the questions, if we are the product of the master's tools, if we've been shaped and made by them, do we really have anything else? And if we don't have anything else, can we not fight at all? And how long do we have to work on ourselves before we can engage in prefigurative politics? So I'm like highlighting and in a certain sense accentuating the differences between these perspectives, but obviously movements and organizations use them in conjunction with each other all the time. I want to sort of spend a little bit of time talking about the benefits and also the dangers of each of these approaches separately, and then talk about some of the ways in which these philosophies are blended in actual movement spaces. So part one, prefigurative politics. And really, I think the reason why people are really drawn to prefigurative politics and why it is such a constant and enduring movement philosophy is the strength of the political vision that it offers. So rather than relying on this kind of like often pessimistic realism of like, there is no alternative, right? Philosophies, we're all broken, we're all fallen, etc. Like prefigurative politics can often like galvanize people into seeing the radical possibilities of another sort of more just, liberated world. And also, I think the reason why it's compelling is that rather than assuming a kind of futuristic utopia, proponents of prefigurative politics argue that, at least in some areas of our work, we can instantiate the world we want to see now. It offers a kind of vision and possibility for something other than piecemeal reforms or band-aids on, like, you know, the gigantic gaping wounds that enframe every moment of our waking existence. And that's pretty appealing, I would say. And so prefigurative politics, I think, are rooted in the possibility of radical action. And in so doing, I think they're also attractive because they foreground the agency of both individuals and collectives in bringing about sort of deep and substantive social change rather than facile and surface levels of social change. The vision is deeply committed to the idea that we don't have to settle for the world as it is, and that the fundamental rules of the game are open to direct challenge. In this sense, I think this like kind of strong ethical position that it has to refuse complicity or play into respectability politics has been really energizing on the radical left. And I think it's also been particularly responsive to and sensitive to intersectional critiques of the way that power structures can make partial concessions while still engaging in divide and conquer tactics. And for this reason is, I think, even more sort of rising in prominence on the left at this moment. This version of politics is also, I think, strengthened by the fact that it can make some pretty strong claims about the relationship between like abstract systems of power, like the heteropatriarchy, and the small scale actions of groups and individuals. In this way, it kind of like radicalizes a sort of version of the personal is political kind of thing, but in a way that is able to open up avenues for individual and collective transformation that is in line with visions of emancipation in ways that I think are really energizing and exciting. However, like all the approaches, like every possibility for change we've ever had, prefigurative politics, I think, also harbors certain difficulties for social justice work. So first, I think the strength and the comprehensiveness of the vision, while it sometimes makes politics feel concretely interpersonal, can also make winning feel impossible, right? In meditating so unflinchingly on the multiple levels of injustice that one has to fight simultaneously in oneself, in one community, in the world, in the structures, right, in the institutions, this approach can sometimes make activists feel as if any gains are so minimal as to be completely unimportant, right? It's just like, also, I would say for many people, like who didn't decide to get PhDs and be like constant gadflies, like it's just exhausting to be critiquing everything and everyone all the time for most of us. And I think that also like feeds into some of these spaces. I think prefigurative politics also sometimes can make forging cross-organizational or cross-issue alliances more difficult. Because in some versions of this approach, any organization that has failed to deeply interrogate each of its own practices or discourses might be dismissed as potential movement partners. It can thus become difficult, I think, for prefigurative collectives to galvanize also newly radicalized people who may not see every layered dimension of injustice in themselves or in the world, in every action or decision, question or consequence. And it can also, I think, therefore lead to a sort of politics of purity that prevents us from forming alliances across differences of social position, proximity to power, or ultimate political vision, in a way that I think contributes to is not responsible for, but contributes to longstanding left sectarianism. I think also in some iterations of prefigurative politics, the necessity of constantly interrogating the how can lead groups to, I gestured to this before, like turn excessively inward, focusing so much on projects of unlearning and reshaping internal organizing dynamics that the kind of outward facing structural change kind of recedes into the background. So the prefigurative approach, I think, contains, like what I'm about to say next about harm reduction politics, both opportunities and challenges. But I think what's really interesting about it is the way that it foregrounds a kind of emergent ethics as a central part of evaluating tactics and strategy, which I think is a really interesting way for social movements to think about what they are up to and what they should be doing. Okay, harm reduction politics. So harm reduction is a term that really came out of radical approaches to public health, specifically around issues like substance abuse, sex work, and other stigmatized practices. Over the years, however, the language of harm reduction has become more common in activist spaces, far beyond this initial context, looking at everything from like passing political reforms to voting as a method for radical activists to engage with powerful institutions. And so from a harm reduction perspective, working with or inside oppressive institutions of power is a negotiated process that centers the how and whether certain tactics can reduce the pain, suffering, or violence that oppressed communities experience in the immediate and short-ish, longish term. So harm reduction's greatest strengths, I think, might be its kind of intensely actionable immediacy, because the paramount value of harm reduction is present effects rather than long-term vision. Its ultimate fidelity is to the concrete circumstances in real, actual living people's lives, what Marx called real historical men, right? So this means that the calculus deployed by harm reduction is less something like, is this course of action good or bad broadly, the gadol, right, in the abstract, and more, does this course of action lead to better or worse effects than the status quo? And in grounding action in an evaluation of better or worse, I think this really opens pathways for more reform strategies that can have substantive effects in the short term. It's also a much easier calculus to make. I think also harm reduction can use a wide range of resources for engaging in social justice work, even when those resources might have complicated and unsavory histories that activists might ultimately condemn. I think this makes them flexible and able to kind of capitalize on kinds of opportunities that prefigurationists might not be able to access. The selective engagement with institutions of power, I think, can also lend a really extraordinary concreteness to social justice demands. So like, rather than aiming for like the abolition of entire complicated systems, hard, right? How do we destroy the heteropatriarchy or the white supremacy or whatever? Harm reductionists can often mobilize around particular policies with concrete evidence for how real lives would be affected by a proposed change. So for this reason, movement gains might be easier to argue for and thus more accessible to large groups of people outside the radical left. And in order to be effective, harm reduction approaches can often thus like sidestep some of these larger and more abstract conversations about systems in order to deliver concrete wins, which I'm also going to argue in a minute, maybe also is a limitation, but it has this at least potential. So in focusing on these like smaller, more specific aims, harm reduction approaches can also hold, I think, more heterogeneity of vision within movement spaces and are therefore well positioned to be effective at building broad-based mass coalitions for targeted reforms. And because it can also more easily reach like not self-identified activists, harm reduction philosophies can also be important bridges into more radical social movement spaces. I think they're often more accessible to newly radicalized people or not yet radicalized people. As you can see, everyone is not yet, everyone is a potentially radicalized member of the radical social movement left in this scenario. But I think the philosophy of harm reduction can also prevent some deep and lasting challenges or constraints. So in the first place, and this is the sort of top line critique always from prefigurationists, is that harm reduction suggests that the goal is reducing, not eliminating harm and the structures that cause it. And so that's a pretty like strong limitation on the vision of what harm reduction can and does accomplish. It can also be really difficult to determine whose harm gets prioritized, especially in situations where group interests might be opposed to one another. And lastly, I think harm reduction approaches can also be more easily co-opted by powerful institutions for those institutions' own ends. In working with and alongside institutions of power, activists often face immense pressure to dampen their rhetoric or to accept compromises that reproduce harm in other ways. And the kind of calculus there can get incredibly complicated and messy. So the sort of last thing that I want to say is that while I've been sort of pulling these apart as really opposed, there is the potential for a kind of blended, what someone like Mari Matsuda will call the both and approach that I want to talk about for just a minute. So like actually existing individuals and organizations rarely fall totally neatly into one or the other. And in any case, each of these approaches contains certain elements of the other, right? Like many elements of harm reduction are also prefigurative. Harm reduction approaches often foreground agency and empathy and care for others, empowerment, bodily autonomy, all these other things that are certainly not structuring conditions of our world, right? Like the fact that we're like leaning into empathy when we're doing harm reduction, we're not mirroring just the conditions of like radical disempathy that we live in. And at its base, prefigurative politics, I think, is also rooted in the desire and the imperative to prevent the reproduction of harm, that is to reduce harm to zero. So again, they're like more convergent than I have been suggesting. And I think many activists and organizations try to model a kind of blended approach. And this is how the legal scholar Mari Matsuda describes this in When the First Quail Calls, which is a beautiful piece for those who haven't read it. So here's an extended quote from Matsuda. Quote, "On the one hand, they respond as legal realists, aware of the historical abuse of the law to sustain existing conditions of domination. Unlike the postmodern critics of the left, however, outsiders, including feminists and people of color, have embraced legalism as a tool of necessity, making legal consciousness their own in order to attack injustice. Thus, to the feminist lawyer faced with pregnant teenagers seeking abortions, it would be absurd to reject the use of an elitist legal system or the use of the concept of rights when such use is necessary to meet the immediate needs of her client. There are times to stand up outside of the courtroom door and say, this procedure is a farce, the legal system is corrupt, justice will never prevail in this land as long as privilege rules in the courtroom. And there are times to stand outside the courtroom and say, this is a nation of laws, laws recognizing fundamental values of rights, equality, and personhood. Sometimes, as Angela Davis did, there's a need to make both speeches in one day," end quote. So Matsuda, I think, highlights the ways that some activists and movements have pursued a kind of both and strategy rather than exclusively functioning within one domain or the other. The dilemma, however, for activists interested in the both and approach is determining not only the overall balance, but also when one might be more appropriate than the other. And this is, so it takes you to a kind of like meta level conversation about how to negotiate the relationship between both of these approaches. All that is to say is that the attempt to find a middle ground between these approaches may also be rife with its own dilemmas. I've often found that when activist communities attempt to pursue both of these approaches simultaneously, they don't simply harness the strengths of each, but they often also take up the weaknesses of both approaches simultaneously, with the additional dilemmas of selecting how and when and where to choose one over the other in a particular instance. That's not to say we shouldn't do it, but it is like, I think we need to confront the reality of how and when our ideas and our theories get implemented, which is, I think, something that philosophers in general could do more clearly and committedly and with more self-awareness and consciousness. So the reality of engaging, I'm going to end in one paragraph. The reality of engaging with radical social justice work is that despite the obviousness of many of the movement's slogans, the embodied practices of engagement often present deep and lasting ethical and political dilemmas, which are neither easily avoided nor resolved. In many cases, they seem like legitimately intractable. My aim in raising these concerns is not to condemn movements who make use of one approach or the other or some kind of complicated synthesis, but rather based in the conviction that understanding the potential dangers of various movement strategies is crucial in being able to evaluate them and thus really to choose them. Understanding the pitfalls of our chosen orientations allows us to be vigilant about them. And liberation movements can always benefit from a clear analysis of the limitations of their chosen orientations. Being self-critical of our tactical choices, I think, is itself an ethical orientation to liberatory practice that we could all do more of. And so it remains vital, I think, to recognize and reflect on these intra-movement debates, not only about what is to be done, but crucially, how it must be done. I'm done.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the unexpected overlaps between your projects, and there's one question in the comments, and so I welcome people to put more, but I'll start with a question to both of you. So Jason's kind of examining the affective orientation that might prevent someone from seeing commodity fetishism or seeing their lack of free will, and thus getting engaged and fighting over these overarching systems. So you say that Spinoza and Marx engage in a different rhetorical move. So instead of just presenting an argument to thinking that people are just open to reason, they do something else, but they're still making an argument in this preemptive strike. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about what the rhetorical difference is in the preemptive strike before the argument. So is that hitting people at a more affective register, or, and I'm thinking of this in connection to your project, Ashley, in terms of the folks who are not radicalized or semi-radicalized, and what level kind of affective engagement can get them involved in political movements, because we've seen in large part how well the right has done this. And I think that it's often a failure that we have, because we think that people are all really open to reason. And anyway, so we kind of forget the material level. So if you folks want to speak to that question first.
Sure, who wants to go? I mean, I can start, I guess. So yeah, thanks for putting it in that way. That was helpful. I mean, one of the things that interests me about this sort of different angle of argument is that when Spinoza says, for example, we're all born ignorant of the causes of things and conscious of our desires, it seems that there's a sort of double-edged sword to that. On the one hand, that's an argument which seems easier to accept than, say, other things Spinoza will say about, like, we're all determined and so on and so forth. People can say, okay, I understand how I don't understand. I come into the world not understanding a lot about the world, and I am aware that I'm hungry, thirsty, etc. But I think the interesting thing about that is that supposed kind of point of ignorance is also very close to what Spinoza will argue is the fundamental truth, that everything strives to persevere in its being. Human beings desire. So this way in which there's a proximity between the sort of idea that's being labeled as a kind of easy to accept idea and the more articulate version. In a similar way, I think that Marx, on the one hand, fetishism is obviously seeing value as it comes from commodities, not seeing the labor, not seeing the relations that determine the different values of different types of labor. But the fact that, as Marx points out, you can only express the value of any commodity in terms of other commodities means that there's already a kind of assertion of a relational dynamic even in the fetishized commodity. So what I think is interesting about both Spinoza and Marx on that point is that there's a sort of dialectic between the false and the truth, that the false idea contains the conditions for the truth. I mean, this goes in terms of talking about points of contact, right? Because I think in some sense, the fundamental paradox that any kind of sort of determinist way of thinking about change is that this sort of problem that you can't think differently until you act differently. You can't act differently until you think differently. So how do you sort of twist? How do you sort of square that circle and begin to think differently and from there act differently? And I think that what I was trying to argue is that for both Spinoza and Marx, there already is the different thought contained within the sort of more ideological thought that then makes possible enacting differently. I mean, that is the way I saw the point of contact between what I was saying, what Ashley was saying, they're framed in very different ways, but I'll turn it over to Ashley to talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the, yes, I think that's the right connection, right? So I'm working on a long project right now about like how we unlearn capitalist values and reflexes. If you're a publisher and you want to publish this, get at me through my website. But like, because like, honestly, I think that if the world were won on arguments alone, if the world were won by having the best data and the best analysis, like the left would win every time. And we don't, right? We lose most of the time. And I think that like the real like explanatory factor here is the way that we often approach organizing as if people are won over by the better argument. And that I just don't think is true. I think part of it has to do with, these kind of like affective orientations that prevent us from recognizing ideology as ideology. But I think we also, and this is like another place that I would turn to Marx, like we have real material stakes sometimes in our illusions, right? And in our narratives and our projected self-conception, in what Du Bois called the psychological wage, which we could expand to be much more, even more wide-ranging than specifically what Du Bois was talking about, which is like white workers and white supremacy. But there is like a lot of structural material factors that inframe our affective relationship to the collective structure of our existence, right? In the political, narratological, economic realms, whatever. And I think if we are only trying to access people, to radicalize them, to get them to do otherwise or be otherwise on the basis of something like a disembodied, like rational argument, I just think that's a losing strategy. And I'm against it because I think we should have good strategy, right? I think we should be effective. And so for me, that really means reactivating and tapping into, not necessarily, though sometimes in a good like propaganda inflammatory way. I'm a great defender of left propaganda. But I think like really foregrounding relationships, like affective embodiment, and also like real motivating factors like fear and anxiety and anger that go into people's self-understanding of who they are, what they do, and therefore what kind of world they're ready to fight for and defend is a really central, it has to be a central way of understanding as scholars like our collective human behavior, and also as activists, how we mobilize people into, like fighting for a world structured otherwise.
We have a question here for Ashley about the relationship between harm reduction and prefigurative politics. From Reese, given the dilemma, it sounds like harm reduction as a singular strategy cannot maintain the utopic vision necessary for prefiguration to step in or alongside more institutional politics. But wouldn't harm reduction really just function as a truncated prefigurative end? In which case, it would seem that what Simon Critchley calls being infinitely demanding through prefigurative politics is ultimately preferable, given that harm reduction seems to straddle both reactionary and radical institutions and spaces. Further, since harm reduction is so much more accommodating and more attractive to more numerous, less radical people, wouldn't it behoove activists to tend towards prefiguration with the understanding that harm reductivists can be pulled along the way towards the coalescent vision of liberation?
What a beautiful question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what that question effectively highlights are some of the drawbacks of harm reduction, without thinking about the ways in which harm reduction, because it can appeal to, can do mass movement work, it can actually move people and make change a lot easier than radical, small scale, fringy collectives of activists who I'm being a bit like overblown about it, but like can't consensus their way into a dinner order, let alone a program for comprehensive, radical, revolutionary change. Again, like I think there are benefits in both of these approaches, but I think we're not particularly served very well by saying like, oh, all these harm reductionists are incapable of great vision or of resisting some of the demands that are put on them, when like, you know, there are tons of amazing harm reduction activists who have, right, broad emancipatory liberationist vision, and also like are very sensitive about the way that they deal with institutions, and pushing against them. And likewise, right, and so I think my point is rather that it's important not to, let's say, narrow our field of vision such that we only emphasize the benefits of an approach or its constraints, but rather that, like, as scholars and also as activists, the important thing to do is to be really clear about what approach you're choosing and like what animates you about it, and also the ways in which that is dangerous for you in the movement. And I think both prefiguration and harm reduction have dangers for the movement. Yeah, that's, I think, what I have to say about that. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, and you know, I've thought of harm reduction more. I've heard the term coming from social work. So people talking about needle exchanges and safe syringe programs and all of this. And this question kind of came to me because the term harm reduction, at least from the people I know in the social work field, it's much preferable to the kind of abstinence only messages that come in other ways. And the alternative is often a little moralistic. So the harm reduction folks are kind of coming against a kind of moralistic opponent. And what I would imagine that people would call harm reductions here in your leftist kind of painting would be, what's it called when you just take one step at a time?
Reformism?
Yeah, like reformists, and I had another word in mind, it'll come. But so they'll think that this step is that this view is more reformist, and therefore, you know, so it's, I'm interested in like kind of the moral valences of that, if you're interested in speaking of that at all.
Yeah. So I like, maybe it'll help. I like cut all of the concrete examples out of this much longer paper to try to fit it into 15 minutes. But so like this, an example out of social, I'm gonna make a full sentence that is gonna have a subject and a verb and a predicate. Okay. Some of the most commonly understood examples of harm reduction come out of like medicine and social work, and are things like needle exchange and condom distribution that are really responding to a kind of highly moralistic abstinence only. If something bad happens to you in the course of doing something we disagree with, you deserve all of the, you know, violence, devastation, and, you know, depravity that gets unleashed on you. And really, that's like where this started. I think inside the radical left, the sort of harm reduction, it doesn't reject that, but I think takes on a different valence. So for example, so much of the mutual aid that we saw come up in the pandemic is really a harm reduction approach to like meeting unmet needs that communities have in the wake of like massive bio and necropolitical sacrifice that you know, our collective institutions wrought and are still raining on us to this day. And so like the reason this is harm reductive is because it's not necessarily like, let's force, you know, a kind of like revolutionary overthrow of the United States government such that we can therefore set up other kinds of institutions for collective provisioning or something like that. It's like, okay, we're gonna fix this problem as best as we can, understanding that there are going to be gaps and limitations to that fix, but it's something we can do right now, and we can prevent X number of more people from starving. We can like provision for some people's funeral expenses or whatever it is. And I think there is like a bit of moralism on both sides of the prefigurationism versus harm reduction debate, right? So to put it very simply, like the prefigurationists will say to the harm reduction people, you're just a bunch of liberal reformists incapable of standing on principle. And the harm reductionists will say to the prefigurationists, like, what privilege you have to like sit in some sort of navel gazing, interior looking leftist bubble, so much so that you can't even deign to come down to the most effective communities and actually like put your money where your mouth is, right? And there's, I think, a lot of acrimony, like there's a lot of acrimony on both sides of this debate. I do think that on especially the harm reductionist side, there has been a sort of reactivation of what on the left it has often been called non-reformist reforms, which is like, how do you argue for reforms with inside institutional spaces that have the horizon, right, or the goal of a more broad scale, somewhat revolutionary transformation? Like, how do you mobilize for reforms with the understanding that no reform will ever be enough? And I think this is actually one of the places where prefigurationists and harm reductionists can often like do really good work together in like arguing for certain kinds of changes, reforms that themselves are like self-consciously tending toward much wider scale social transformation than the actual like text of the reform would suggest. Like defunding police, right, I think is one of these non-reformist reforms, which has the horizon of total abolition and enacts that in a sort of step on the way toward something like total abolition.
Great example. Jason, we have a question here from Brandon about thinking of philosophy as praxis. And the question is, if you were to use Ashley's distinction between harm reduction or prefiguration, if philosophy is a praxis, do you believe that we should do it according to a harm reduction, prefigurative, or some other type of strategic approach?
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense the idea that Marx doesn't initiate a new philosophy of praxis, but a new practice of philosophy is in some sense closer to, in a very strange way, and I almost regret to say this, a kind of harm reduction sort of notion, right? That you intervene their prevailing ideologies, you intervene, you work in and through them, you try to transform them, question them. You don't, it's not a, I mean, I think there's a certain deflationary aspect of that definition of philosophy. You're not trying to give people an entire picture of the universe, the world, and the meaning of everything. You're intervening in very specific places in trying to contest, undermine, and problematize particular ways of thinking about the world as they connect to and duplicate particular material structures of domination. It's a very different, it sort of goes back and forth, this debate, there are some people who claim, Marx is a philosophy. Some people claim Marx isn't a philosophy, and that's a good thing. And in some sense, it's more of a problematization of the place from which philosophy articulates and frames its problems. And to some extent, and I never thought of it this way, it's closer to that kind of situational intervention that brings it along a certain kind of harm reduction. I wouldn't want to equate the two because there are so many other sort of notions around that, but it does seem to me on the side of the situational rather than the sort of global. Although I do think that you can't really I think in a similar way, you can't really intervene situationally without engaging with some of those sort of more totalizing sort of problems. And that is the kind of practice that is being talked about here.
Thank you. All right, here's another question. Here, sorry, I've been like copying them down. Ashley, I wonder if perhaps common problems on both sides is orthodoxy and individualism. I wonder if you've thought about methods that allow people to create visions more collectively at the same time that they can consider practical next steps to reduce harm. And if so, could you speak to that?
Yeah, so one of the other things that I do in my life that is not being a professor is I like run workshops for activist collectives on a lot of these things, like the actual like how-to methods of some of these things. So I want to be brief, but like all that is to say is that I think the way that decision making happens and the way that visioning happens inside activist organizations can really run a spectrum of like top down to bottom up. And then we could like expand about like how power sensitive is this process, how individualist is it, how consensus based is it, et cetera. Like there are tons and tons and tons of ways that that the actual decision making, visioning, and strategy setting process works inside the activist sphere. So it's hard to give like a, here are these 3 ways, like there are a ton of them. But I don't necessarily think that whether the arrived at strategy is harm reduction or prefiguration itself necessarily maps easily onto whether that vision and that goal was set collectively or individually or in a top-down or in a bottom-up way. There are tons and tons of permutations of like structure, decision-making style, communication style, you know, size, and these strategic considerations.
We've had a couple of questions about climate change, and so I want to read them both together and then put them to both of you to speak to. So one question is, would then a goal of effective change agents be to strategize a preemptive radicalization of the leftist youth, specifically to claim moral agency and personal responsibility for a sustainable social condition? Is harm removal possible in terms of carbon negative practices? That's one question. And then we have a question, how do we think about climate change in terms of harm reduction and prefigurative approaches? Isn't the problem that we can't think about the harm of climate change for many practical reasons, but, and here to Jason, the issue is coming up with new practices or recovering older practices that is both prefigurative and harm reducing as new practice. We have a lot to chew on there. Who wants to go first?
I like that the first question was like, shouldn't we corrupt the youth? To which I say, yes, we should always corrupt the youth. This is, yeah. If we have a mandate as a discipline, I think it's that, right? Like, so yes, corrupt the youth all the time. This is like this is our bread and butter.
Got involved in philosophy for children, and I totally agree. This is what we should be doing.
Obviously, right? Like, this is the ace in the hole for us. I'm not sure I caught exactly what part of that second question was for me. Like, should we do both? If the question is like, for any issue, including climate change, do I think that the most effective strategy is both reducing harms as they occur and trying to transform the large-scale structural factors that give rise to this problem in the first place? Yes. Obviously, yes, right? Like for me, I'm like, yeah, we have to do all of this all the time because we're in such a disastrous mess that like we have to both attend to the wounds that are actively bleeding and we have to solve the systemic disease. I think the reason why these debates come up are not because anyone is like, yeah, whatever, like let some people bleed out and like, or like just let the infection rage. Like, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that like, organizing is hard. It is time intensive. It is emotionally challenging. Like it is like once you have like not just work-life balance, but work-life organizing balance, it is incredibly challenging. And that forces us to make choices between goals that are both worthy and both valuable. And so I don't think that this debate comes up because like people are like, because anyone thinks that structural scale change and immediate like relief are invaluable, but rather that we have a really hard time with how overburdened and small the radical left is at the moment, doing both at one and the same time, and therefore we have to make choices. So for me, obviously the answer is like we turn everyone into the radical left and we can pursue both at the same time, but that is itself a kind of vision of what we want and not a sober analysis of the, you know, tactical decision making we have to make in the present.
Yeah, and this is making me think of another conversation that we should have in another month, because so many people involved with the RPA are scholars and organizers. And I think having this discussion about work-life organizing balance is so important. So we'll have to have you back, Ashley, if you want to talk
Let's do
about
it.
that. Mhm.
Maybe someone else can tell me how to do it. I would love that.
You know, right, where's the secret?
Yeah, right.
Jason, do you want to talk about climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do. And I think one of the things, and sort of stay on my topic, but also address the issue. I think that one of the things that I really take from both Spinoza and Marx and the way I was writing about them is that the important arguments to have are not arguments with this or that specific philosophy, but the arguments that address the prevailing sort of sensibility, both affective and sort of common sense at a given time. And that's what I think both Marx was doing in the Commodity Fetishism section and Spinoza was doing in the Appendix of Part 1 of the Ethics. And I think that sensibility changes. And I think right now we're living in an age in which my experience, and people may have different experience in different locations, is in terms of the youth, is there's not a lot of sort of buy-in to the prevailing ideology. What there is a lot of sense of kind of a fatalism. I mean, when it comes to climate change, that there's like little that can be done. This is happening. There's little that can be done, and a sort of resignation. So I think and this is what makes the sort of stuff that Ashley was talking about very important. I think that people don't need a new criticism of the existing society. I think that criticism is already kind of, for many, not all, but for many, already kind of internalized in a sort of sense of this awareness of the failures, especially in the past year, the failures of our existing society to offer anything like a desirable, livable kind of life for especially for young people. And so the real task is moving beyond the sense that that's the best one could hope for, right? That there's no alternative, and beginning to believe in the possibility that we can individually and collectively do better and create a different world. And I think that that's a harder thing to do. I think especially for philosophers, criticism is easy in some way, and imagining the possibility that things could be otherwise is harder, because at the moment we're living in, so much of the prevailing sort of affective and ideological sort of assemblage is one that says, look, the best one can hope for is everyone pursues their own self-interest. Anything else leads to disaster. It's a sort of never ever try. People tried stuff in the 20th century. Look what happened. Let's just sort of protect your own, fend for yourself, and that's the best one can hope for. And I think that is a philosophy that's very pervasive, but one that will lead to incredibly horrible effects in terms of climate, in terms of social life, in social world, in terms of everything.
Oh, I think you're so right. And, I know that you, Jason, you have a class on work itself and you focus on this. And so we need to have you in on this conversation, because some of the messages about self-care, whereas it's really important, are highly individualizing. And so I think that we do need to think about care in groups, but a lot of this is like secure your own life vest. Everything's burning, get out while you can. And that's not a recipe for, for future liberatory practices. I want to close, so we're a little bit over time, but I want to close with a question that we got at the beginning about teaching. That's something that the three of us share in common. And this question is regarding our teaching with the master's tools. Often the students will punish a professor who works outside their expectations. Talking about that is important, I think, but also realizing, in my opinion, the ability to reach the few students one can this way. So to speak to that question, or to speak more broadly about, being a scholar activist in the classroom and teaching as leftist praxis, if you each would like to address that for a moment as we close. I should do better as a moderator at calling on people to say who goes first. Jason, do you want to speak to this question first?
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting question in terms of, I feel like in some sense, philosophy as a discipline has taken the anti-Audre Lorde position that you can use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. And everything I've sort of done has sort of been in line with that. I mean, at least today, not everything I've ever done. But, and I do think that there are a lot of questions to be had about that. And I do think that, I mean, as you said, your question, sometimes it does feel like a part of what I'm doing. And I think part of this notion of thinking things as practices, every practice has its limits, right? Teaching has its limits because the kind of institution we're in, the kind of desires that are brought into the classroom, we have to recognize those limits and be able to, in some sense, work with them. I mean, I think the sort of tension is on the one hand, you don't want to pretend like teaching can be something other than it is. It's not politics, right? But on the other hand, you don't want to completely capitulate to the norms imposed by its institutional place. Like all I'm doing is sort of, participating in this process of accreditation and so on and so forth. So the trick is both recognizing the limitations of the particular space and practice you're engaged in, but at the same time trying to challenge and do as much within that limited space as you possibly can do. And I think a lot of it has to do with engaging students at the level of the kind of questions they have. I mean, you mentioned I teach a class about work, and part of the reason I teach a class about work is that students in the university what I teach in, which is very much oriented towards working class students, people returning back to college, have a lot of questions about the kind of life that they're going to be able to make possible through work. And so we can start there, and then we can ask some other questions that they might not have already thought of, and we can go to a different space from a place. But you have to address people from a place that they have already kind of started from.
Yeah, I'll say that far and away the thing that has made me become a better teacher, and I'm not claiming to be like the best teacher that's ever been, but like is organizing skills, not having been taught in the academy, right? Like I don't feel like the academy and the education that we get as graduate students, or like throw the graduate students to the wolves and they'll figure out how to teach approach, really is useful for thinking about how to engage and embody radical principles in the classroom. But I do feel like doing a lot of like participatory community action, adult education stuff inside the radical left has given me like, some tools to do that. And one of the things that I'll say is that I really like take the lesson from organizing to meet people where they're at and then move with them, right? Another way that this is talked about is an ethics of accompaniment. And so when I first started like trying to approach radical pedagogy in the classroom, I really sometimes like experienced the like negative pushback from students, and then was like, so I have to, like, they are my enemies and I must like move them. And that's not a great approach, I think. And so I think sometimes we take the principles of radical action, like we've got to decolonize the classroom or whatever that means, and we think that our students, for reasons both legitimate and illegitimate, are adversarial in relationship to us in the project of producing a more just and inclusive classroom space. And it took me some years to move out of that mindset and much more into an like, how am I bringing students into a collective project here? And what are there are limitations to that, but also like, how am I being transformed by them as they are being transformed by me and as they are being transformed by each other? And how can we put that together in a like in a process of mutual accompaniment, which is how I would really think about my pedagogy now. If you want to listen to more about this, I run a podcast about radical pedagogy called Pedagogies for Peace that you can find wherever you get your podcast, and you can hear me talk about this at length.
That's great. And I love how you're speaking to meeting the students where they are, and instead of just thinking that we're going to present this argument to them. And Jason, how you're saying that we have to see what the students want to know, what they're thinking about, how to live a good life, and then how we can help them or accompany them, and they us, on this project. I want to thank you both for taking time out of your afternoon, especially during this really difficult period of time, to have this conversation, which I think is really important. And I've enjoyed the questions that have come up in the comments. I haven't been able to ask all of them, so I encourage both of you to go check them out afterwards, and you can see questions that people have had for you. I want to remind everybody that next month we'll be back, but on the second Monday, with Ben Curtis and Reese Faust. Thanks, Ashley and Jason. This has been a delight, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks so much.